In a limestone cave in what is now northern Spain, archaeologists uncovered the skeleton of a Neanderthal known as Shanidar, another prehistoric individual whose bones revealed something unexpected. Severe physical impairments survived for years because other people kept that individual alive. Now imagine a different condition, one that leaves no mark on bone. You're born about 30,000 years ago. Your eyes can see every detail a few steps away, but the landscape beyond becomes a blur. No glasses, no surgery, no written language to explain what's happening, yet every day depends on seeing the world correctly. At first, it sounds like a simple death sentence, but the archaeological and biological evidence tells a far more surprising story. So what would actually happen if you were born with nearsightedness in the Stone Age? That's exactly what we're about to find out. And consider subscribing. It genuinely helps the channel make more videos like this. The invisible handicap. The first problem is that we don't actually know how many Stone Age people were nearsighted. Myopia doesn't leave traces on skeletons, so archaeologists can't dig up an ancient skull and measure its prescription. Instead, researchers have to combine genetics, modern hunter-gatherer studies, evolutionary biology, and evidence about prehistoric lifestyles. That immediately overturns one common assumption. Many people imagine that poor eyesight must have been incredibly common throughout human history. The evidence points in the opposite direction. Studies of traditional hunter-gatherer populations consistently find much lower rates of myopia than industrialized societies. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, one of the best-studied hunter-gatherer groups, researchers reported myopia rates around 5 to 10% before age 40, far below those seen in modern urban populations, where prevalence among young adults can exceed 50% in many countries. That doesn't mean Stone Age people never became nearsighted. It means they were probably much less likely to develop it during childhood. But suppose you were one of the exceptions. What then? Imagine standing on an open plain. Someone else notices a herd of deer nearly 200 meters away. You don't. The animals are already moving before you realize they're there. Distance matters in hunting, spotting predators, navigating unfamiliar terrain, recognizing faces across a valley, or simply keeping up with your group. The severity would depend entirely on your prescription. A mild myopia of around -1 diopter might only blur distant details. A much stronger prescription could make survival dramatically more difficult. Yet there's an important detail people often overlook. Hunter-gatherers weren't action movie snipers constantly chasing prey across enormous distances. Ethnographic studies show hunting relied on tracking footprints, reading broken branches, recognizing animal behavior, cooperation, persistence, traps, ambushes, and knowledge accumulated over years. Vision mattered. But it wasn't the only skill keeping people alive, and that's where the story takes an unexpected turn. For decades, archaeologists have uncovered individuals from prehistoric populations who survived astonishing injuries. One famous example comes from Shanidar Cave in Iraq, where Neanderthal remains show an individual who had lost part of an arm, suffered serious injuries, and lived for years afterward. Another comes from Dmanisi in Georgia, where researchers discovered an elderly Homo erectus individual who had lost nearly all of their teeth long before death, yet survived because food was likely prepared by others. These discoveries transformed how scientists think about prehistoric societies. Early humans weren't surviving as isolated individuals. They survived as communities. That changes everything about disabilities, including poor eyesight. If someone couldn't excel at long-distance hunting, they could still contribute in countless other ways. Preparing food, making stone tools, working hides, weaving plant fibers, teaching children, maintaining fires, processing gathered plants, repairing weapons, passing knowledge between generations. In hunter-gatherer societies, survival wasn't determined by one ability alone. It depended on how the group combined different strengths. And ironically, nearsightedness might have made one important task easier. Myopia reduces distance vision. It doesn't necessarily reduce close vision. In fact, close work is often where nearsighted people perform best without correction. Now think about what Stone Age technology actually required. Crafting stone tools wasn't simply smashing rocks together. Knapping demanded precise strikes separated by millimeters. Making bone needles required incredible fine motor control. Preparing animal hides involved scraping delicate surfaces without damaging them, string, baskets, ornaments, pigments, carved antlers. Many archaeological discoveries reveal astonishing craftsmanship, requiring sustained attention to nearby detail. Could a nearsighted individual have specialized in these activities? We can't prove it directly, but biologically, it's entirely plausible. And prehistoric societies repeatedly demonstrate one consistent pattern. Division of labor made groups stronger. If severe myopia made survival impossible, we would expect the genetic variants associated with it to disappear over thousands of generations. They didn't. Modern genetic studies have identified hundreds of variants linked to myopia, each contributing a small effect. Large genome-wide association studies led by international collaborations such as the CREAM Consortium and UK Biobank show that myopia is highly polygenic. But genes are only part of the story. The environment has an enormous influence. Children who spend more time outdoors are consistently less likely to develop myopia, while years of intensive near work and education increase the risk. Clinical trials, including the Guangzhou Outdoor Activity Longitudinal Study, found that adding outdoor time during the school day reduced the incidence of myopia in school children. Several systematic reviews have reached the same conclusion. That creates an evolutionary puzzle. Many genetic variants associated with myopia are ancient, yet the explosive rise in nearsightedness is remarkably recent. Researchers believe our modern environment, not our DNA alone, is largely responsible. In other words, someone born with your exact genes tens of thousands of years ago might never have become as nearsighted as you are today. The Stone Age wasn't necessarily selecting against every myopic gene. Instead, it was exposing people to an entirely different visual environment. That doesn't mean poor eyesight was harmless. A highly myopic hunter unable to detect predators, identify dangerous terrain, or recognize distant signals would face obvious disadvantages. In harsh winters, during migrations, or when food became scarce, every limitation mattered more. Small bands couldn't always afford to compensate for every weakness. There were probably individuals whose vision reduced their chances of surviving or raising children. Scientists simply cannot measure how often that happened, because myopia leaves almost no archaeological signature. And there's another complication. Stone Age life wasn't one lifestyle. Humans occupied African savannas, European forests, Arctic tundra, tropical coastlines, mountain valleys, and deserts over tens of thousands of years. The demands on vision differed across those environments. Someone who relied heavily on long-distance scanning in open grasslands may have struggled more than someone living in dense woodland where many tasks happened at closer range. So there isn't one universal answer. There are probabilities shaped by biology, culture, and ecology. Go back to that imagined child standing outside a cave, watching the horizon dissolve into a blur. At first glance, it seems like nature had already decided that child's fate. But archaeology tells a more nuanced story. Again and again, prehistoric humans cared for injured companions, elderly adults, and people who could no longer perform every physically demanding task. Evolution rewarded cooperation just as much as strength. Poor eyesight may have closed certain doors, it likely opened others, and the group often determined which mattered most. The greatest advantage our ancestors developed wasn't sharper vision. It was the ability to share skills that no single individual possessed alone. That may be one of the reasons our species spread across nearly every environment on Earth. When we picture prehistoric survival, we usually imagine the fastest runner, the strongest hunter, or the fiercest warrior. The evidence suggests something less dramatic and far more interesting. Human success came from communities where different abilities could complement one another. If you had been born nearsighted in the Stone Age, your life would almost certainly have been harder. But harder is not the same as impossible. That distinction reminds us that evolution doesn't produce perfect individuals. It produces populations capable of adapting together. And perhaps that's the clearest lesson hidden in this question. Survival has never depended on one perfect trait. More often, it has depended on imperfect people finding ways to help each other. If this kind of evidence-based journey through history and science is your kind of curiosity, I'd love to have you here for the next one.